wanted the deed to the lake house. She said it in front of my granddaughter. I did not raise my voice. I want you to picture the room first, because the room matters. It was the back porch of my place out on Long Pond. The one my late wife Helen and I built in the summer of 1987, with our own hands and a contractor named Bud, who drank too much beer and laid the best tongue-and-groove pine I have ever seen. 40 years. That porch has held 40 years of Saturday breakfasts and birthday candles, and a casket spray the morning we drove Helen down to St. Mark's for the last time. The porch knows me. The porch has earned its place. It was the Sunday after Labor Day, 2025. I had cooked. I always cook. Blueberry pancakes from the bog out behind the shed, the bacon from Reggie's smokehouse over in Pittsburgh, fresh squeezed orange juice because my granddaughter Hattie likes the pulp. Hattie is 9. She had powdered sugar on her chin, and she was telling me about her social studies project on the Wabanaki, and I was listening. And across the table, my son Marcus was on his phone, and his wife Bryn was watching me the way a real estate agent watches an old building she intends to demolish. I'm Theodore. Most people call me Theo. I am 68 years old. I founded a small marine engineering firm in 1991 out of a one-room office above a hardware store in Bath, Maine, and by the time I sold my majority stake in 2019, we had 83 employees and contracts with the Navy and 3 private yards. I am not telling you this to boast. I am telling you so you understand that when my daughter-in-law asked me in front of my grandchild to sign the lake house over to her and my son, I knew exactly what she was asking, and I knew exactly what it was worth. And I knew exactly what kind of person asks a question like that at a breakfast table. She said, "Theo, we need to talk about the property." I poured Hattie more juice. I said, "Sweetheart, why don't you take your sketchbook down to the dock and see if you can draw that heron?" Hattie went. She is a good kid. She is the only good thing in this story for a long time, so hold on to her. Once the screen door slapped shut behind her, Bryn started in. She had a folder. An actual manila folder with tabs, the kind a paralegal makes up for a deposition. She said the lake house was a liability for me. She said at my age I shouldn't be climbing on the roof in the fall to clean the gutters. She said Marcus had been carrying me emotionally since Helen passed, and it was time to make things structurally fair. Those were her words. Structurally fair. Those were her words. Structurally fair. She slid a quitclaim deed across the table. Already drawn up. Already notary blocked. I looked at my son, my boy, my only child, who I had taught to bait a hook on that very dock, who had thrown up off the porch the night of his high school prom, who I had co-signed for at UMaine and again at law school, and again on the first house in Falmouth. Marcus would not meet my eyes. I said, very quietly, "Whose name goes on it?" Bryn said, "Both of ours. Joint with right of survivorship." I said, "And if your marriage doesn't last?" She actually laughed. She said, "Theo, don't be morbid. Now, I want to back up. Because to understand what came next, you have to understand what came before, and I am not going to skip that part, the way some of these stories do. I owe you the whole picture. Helen and I had Marcus late. I was 36, she was 34, and we'd been trying for almost a decade. When he finally came, on a January morning in a snowstorm so heavy the plows couldn't reach the hospital, I held him in the delivery room and I cried like a man who had just been handed the world. Helen used to say, I ruined him from the first hour. She wasn't wrong. I gave that boy everything. New cleats every spring, even though his feet hadn't grown. A car at 16, used but mine. Tuition, no loans. Law school, no loans. The down payment on the Falmouth house in 2014. $68,000, wired the morning of the closing. I never asked for a thank you. I figured the thank you was the life he was building. He met Bryn in 2016. She was a junior associate at his firm, 3 years older than him, from a family in Connecticut that I gathered had money once and didn't anymore. She was beautiful. I'll grant her that, in a sharp, careful way, like a knife you keep on a high shelf. From the first dinner I had a feeling, and I told Helen, and Helen said, "Theo, don't be one of those fathers." So I shut up. That is the great regret of my late marriage. I shut up when I should have spoken, because Helen was dying by then, and I didn't want to fight her on the small things. Helen passed in March of 2021. Pancreatic. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the morning I closed her eyes. Marcus and Bryn had been married 18 months. Hattie was 4, at the reception after the service. Here at the lake house, because Helen wanted it that way, Bryn cornered me by the deviled eggs and asked if I had given any thought to estate planning. 11 weeks. 11 weeks, my wife had been in the ground, more or less, and her name was on the deviled eggs plate Helen's sister had brought. And Bryn was asking about estate planning. I said, "Not today, Bryn." She said, "Of course, of course, of course. I just want you taken care of, Theo." That was the first time I understood that my daughter-in-law was not a person who liked me. She was a person who liked what I had. Over the next 4 years, it got worse. Slowly, the way a leak gets worse. Marcus started skipping the lake on weekends. Bryn would call and say Hattie had a birthday party, Hattie had a recital, Hattie had a stomach bug, and the visits dropped from twice a month to once a month to once a quarter. When they did come up, Bryn would walk through my house like an appraiser. She'd open closets. She'd ask about the appraisal on the back lot. Once I caught her photographing Helen's wedding china. I let it go. I let all of it go. Because Marcus was still my boy, and Hattie was the light of my life. And I thought, well, this is the price of being in the picture. I thought Helen would want me to keep the peace. Helen would not have wanted me to keep that kind of peace. I know that now. So, the folder. The quitclaim deed. Bryn watching me across the breakfast table with that careful, hungry face, and Marcus staring at his phone like the screen contained the answer to a question he was too tired to ask. I said, "I'm not signing this." Bryn said, "Theo." I said, "It's not happening. Not today. Not next year. Not ever." She said, "You're being selfish." I said, "Brennan, this is the house where I held my wife's hand when she was dying. This is the house where my granddaughter learned to swim. This is not an asset. This is my home." And that is when she stood up. And she walked around the table, and before I understood what was about to happen, she leaned down and she slapped me. Open hand, hard enough that my hearing aid popped out of my left ear and skittered across the floorboards. Hard enough that I tasted copper inside my cheek. There was a long, ringing silence, the kind you get on a lake at dawn when the loons stop. Marcus looked up from his phone. He saw my face. He saw his wife standing over me with her hand still raised. And what he said, what my own son said in that moment, was, "Dad, why do you have to make everything so difficult?" That is the sentence I will take to my grave. Not the slap. The sentence. "I'd like to tell you," I roared. "I'd like to tell you I stood up and threw her off my porch into the lake. I did not. I sat there for what felt like a long time, and I picked up my hearing aid off the floor, and I wiped it on my shirt, and I put it back in my ear. And I said very calmly, "Bryn, Marcus, I'd like you to go inside and pack a bag. You're leaving." Bryn said, "Theo, don't be dramatic. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." I said, "You meant to. You absolutely meant to. Go pack." Marcus said, "Dad." I said, "Go." They went. Not because they were sorry. Because they thought I would calm down. Because they thought, the way people like that always think, that the old man would crumple by supper time and call to apologize and offer them a cup of tea in the deed. While they were upstairs, I walked out to the dock. Hattie was lying on her stomach drawing the heron, which had not moved, which is what herons do. I sat down next to her. My cheek was hot. My ear was ringing on the inside even with the aid back in. I said, "Sweetheart, Grandpa needs to make a couple of phone calls. I need you to stay here on the dock for a little while. Can you do that?" She said, "Are you okay, Pop Pop?" I said, "I am going to be." I walked to the end of the dock. I called my attorney. Her name is Margaret Sutherland. She is 66 years old. She has been my lawyer since 1994. She lives 22 minutes from the lake house, and she answers her phone on a Sunday because Margaret is not the kind of woman who lets a phone ring when she sees my name on it. I told her what had happened. Just the facts, no editorializing. The deed, the slap, the sentence from my son. Margaret was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Theo, do not let them leave with anything. I'm getting in the car." I said, "How long?" She said, 40 minutes, maybe 35 if I push it. I said, "Push it." Then I made my second call. To my financial advisor, a man named Carter Mendelson out of Portland who has handled my accounts for 17 years. I told him I needed 3 things done by end of business Monday. He said, "Tell me." I said, "First, freeze every account Marcus has access to. The Roth he inherited from Helen, the brokerage account I added him to in 2018, and the operating line at the firm that still has his name on it from when he did contract work for us in 2015. He said, "Done. What else?" I said, "Second, the trust we set up after Helen passed, the one with Hattie as contingent. I want the language changed. I want Marcus removed as primary. I want Hattie moved up. I want a corporate trustee, not Marcus." He said, "We can have the amendment drafted tomorrow morning. Margaret will have to sign off." I said, "Margaret is on her way to me right now." He said, "Then we'll have it by Tuesday." "What's the third?" I said, "Third, the house in Falmouth, the one I helped them buy." He said, "You're on the deed." I said, "You're on the deed." I said, "I am on the deed. As a tenant in common, 20%. Helen and I did it that way on purpose because she said, and I quote, "I don't trust that woman." That was 2017. He said, "Helen was a smart woman." I said, "Helen was a genius. Get me a partition action drafted. I want my 20% back." He said, "Theo, you know what that does." I said, "I know exactly what it does. It forces a sale or a buyout. They cannot afford to buy me out because I know what they make and I know what they spend. So they will have to sell. And I want them to sell, Carter. I want them to learn what it costs to slap a man in his own house." He said, "Understood." I walked back up to the porch. Marcus and Bryn were in the kitchen. Bryn had been crying, or had arranged her face to look like she had. Marcus was leaning against the counter holding a glass of water like a prop. Bryn said, "Theo, I have been thinking, and I want to apologize. I was emotional. I have been under so much stress with work and Hattie's school, and—" I said, "Stop." She said, "Theo, please." I said, "Stop." She said, "Theo, please." I said, "Stop. Margaret will be here in 35 minutes. You are welcome to stay until she arrives, or you are welcome to leave now. I would prefer you leave now." Marcus said, "Dad, what is Margaret coming here for?" I said, "She's bringing some paperwork." He said, "What paperwork?" I said, "Son, listen to me very carefully. For 34 years I have given you every single thing you have asked me for, and a great many things you did not even know to ask for. I co-signed. I paid tuition. I wired you $68,000 on a Tuesday morning so you could buy a house in a town I will never live in. I have never once in 34 years asked you for anything back, and the one thing I ever needed from you, the one single thing, was for you to stand up just now and tell your wife she does not get to put her hand on your father. And you did not do it. You asked me why I was being difficult. He started to say something. I held up a hand. I said, you will leave my house. You will leave it today. You will not come back until you understand what just happened in this kitchen. And the paperwork Margaret is bringing is going to make sure that, in the meantime, you have a chance to find out what it is like to live the life you have actually built, instead of the life I have been quietly subsidizing since you were 18 years old. Bryn said, Theo, you are out of your mind. I said, Bryn, I have never been more clear in my life. She tried one more angle. She said, and what about Hattie? Are you going to punish Hattie for this? I said, Hattie is the one person in this house I am protecting. That landed. She didn't have an answer. They left. Marcus carried 2 duffels out to the SUV. Bryn would not look at me. She put her sunglasses on inside the house, which is the most Bryn thing she has ever done. I walked Hattie up from the dock and told her Mommy and Daddy had to head back early, but that I would call her that night, and we would FaceTime about the heron. She hugged me around the waist, and she said, Pop, your face is red. I said, I am okay, sweetheart. She said, are you sad? I said, a little, but I am going to be all right. Grandpa is going to be all right. Grandpa is going to be all right. She held on to me a second longer than usual. I think she knew. Kids know things. Margaret arrived 38 minutes after my call. She came up the porch steps with a banker's box and her reading glasses already on her nose. She took one look at my face. I had ice on it by then, and she said, Theodore, we are going to handle this. We sat at the porch table where the quitclaim deed still lay, and we worked until almost 10 p.m. We drafted 3 things. A formal demand letter to Marcus and Bryn regarding the Falmouth property and my intention to partition. A letter to the trust company initiating the amendment to remove Marcus and elevate Hattie. And a 3rd letter, which I did not enjoy writing, formally disinheriting my son from my personal estate, with a contingent provision routing his share into a trust for Hattie's benefit upon her 25th birthday, with my sister-in-law Helen's sister, a retired math teacher named Roberta, as trustee. Margaret said, Theo, you are absolutely sure about the disinheritance. I said, I am absolutely sure he watched his wife strike his father and asked me why I was being difficult. I am absolutely sure. She said, and Hattie. I said, Hattie gets everything. In trust, with Roberta watching it. Bryn doesn't get within 10 miles of $1 of it. She nodded. She signed her name as witness. We FedExed the originals first thing Monday morning to Carter and to the trust company. I want to tell you what happened over the next 6 weeks. Because the actual revenge, if you want to call it that, was not the slap returned or the screaming match. It was the slow, methodical, perfectly legal unwinding of a life that had been built on my checkbook. Monday afternoon, Marcus discovered the brokerage account was frozen. He called me. I let it go to voicemail. He called 4 more times. I let those go too. Then he called Carter, who informed him politely that the assets in question were mine, that his name had been on the account as a courtesy and as a beneficiary, and that the courtesy had been withdrawn. Tuesday morning, the operating line at the firm was closed. He had been pulling about $4,000 a quarter out of it, ostensibly for contract work he had stopped doing in 2019. I had let it ride for 6 years because I figured the money was helping with Hattie. Tuesday morning that stopped. Wednesday the partition action was filed in Cumberland County. Bryn called me Wednesday afternoon. I answered that one because I wanted to hear it. She said, Theo, this is insane. You are going to make us sell our house. I said, I am going to make you buy me out at fair market value or sell the house. Yes. She said, we cannot afford to buy you out. I said, I know. She said, Hattie's school. I said, Hattie's school is the public elementary in Falmouth, Bryn, which is excellent. Hattie is going to be fine. The question is whether you are going to be fine. And I have to tell you, I am no longer particularly invested in the answer. She said, you are a cruel old man. I said, I am a man whose face you put your hand on, in front of his grandchild, in his own house, after he cooked you breakfast. Goodbye, Bryn. I hung up. I have not spoken to her since. Thursday, I changed the locks on the lake house. Both doors. The boathouse. I gave a key to Margaret and to my neighbor Doris, who has watched my place every winter since 1998, and that was it. Friday, I had the trust amendment signed. Hattie is now my primary heir, in trust, with Roberta as trustee, with strict instructions that no funds may be dispersed to a parent or guardian without trustee approval, and that distributions begin at age 25 with full vesting at 35. Bryn's name is mentioned in the document exactly once, in a sentence that reads, "Under no circumstances shall the beneficiary's mother serve as trustee, co-trustee, or advisor to the trust." I imagine Bryn read that sentence at some point. I would have liked to see her face. The next Sunday, 8 days after the slap, my son drove up to the lake house alone. He sat in the driveway in his SUV for about 20 minutes before he came to the door. I watched him through the kitchen window. He looked, I will say, like a man who had been awake for several nights. I let him in. I poured him a coffee. We sat on the porch where it had happened. He said, "Dad, please." I said, "Tell me what you're sorry for, specifically." He started in on a speech. Bryn was under pressure. The mortgage. Hattie's tutoring. Bryn's anxiety. I let him go for about 90 seconds. Then I said, "Marcus, stop. You are telling me about your wife. I am asking you about you. You watched her hit me. And you asked me why I was difficult. What are you sorry for?" He cried then. My son cried at my breakfast table for the first time since he was a teenager. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up. I'm sorry I didn't say anything. I'm sorry I let it happen." I said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because I was afraid of her." There it was. The truth. My boy was afraid of his wife. I want to tell you I forgave him on the spot. I did not. I am not built that way, and I have been around the block too many times to believe a single conversation closes a wound that took years to open. But I did say this. I said, "Marcus, here is what I will offer. The disinherited stands. The partition action stands. The partition action stands." Those are not coming back, because those were never things you earned. They were things I gave, and I am taking them back. He nodded. I said, "But the door to this house is not closed to you, just to her. If you want a relationship with me, and you want a relationship between Hattie and me, that can exist. It will not include Bryn. It will not happen on her terms, and it will require you, every single time, to choose between the version of yourself who let her hit me and the version of yourself I raised. I will not do that work for you. You will." He said, "What if I can't leave her?" I said, "Then you have made your choice, and I have made mine, and we will both live with what we chose." He sat on my porch for another hour. He did not promise anything. I respect that, in a way. The Marcus I might have once had would have promised everything in that hour and meant none of it. The man on my porch knew, finally, that promises in our family had a price now. He drove back to Falmouth that night. Hattie and I FaceTimed the next morning. We do it every Sunday now, and most Wednesdays. She showed me a new drawing of the heron. She told me she had named him Mr. Fenwick. I told her Mr. Fenwick was a fine name for a heron. She said, Pop, when can I come back to the lake?" I said, "Soon, sweetheart. We are working it out." It took 4 months. By February, Marcus and I had negotiated, through Margaret and his own attorney, a visitation schedule that allows Hattie to come up to the lake 1 weekend a month, dropped off and picked up by Marcus, alone. Bryn does not enter my property. Bryn does not ride in the car. Hattie does not know yet, fully, what happened. She knows Grandma Bryn and Pop had a fight. She is 9. That is enough for now. When she is older, I will tell her the truth, because I do not believe in lying to children about who their family is. The Thelmouth house sold in April. Marcus and Bryn moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Westbrook. I am told Bryn is furious. I am told she blames me. I am told she has told her family in Connecticut that I am a controlling, abusive father-in-law who has poisoned her husband against her. I have heard all of this through the long grapevine of small-town Maine, where everybody knows everybody, and Margaret has lunch with 3 of Bryn's cousins. I do not respond to any of it. There is nothing to respond to. Marcus and I have dinner once a month now, at a diner in Brunswick, halfway between us. We talk about Hattie. We talk about the firm. We do not talk about Bryn. He has not left her. I did not expect him to, but the man across the booth from me is a different man than the one who sat in my kitchen and asked why I was being difficult. I see him understand things now. I see him pick up the check sometimes, which he has never in his life done. It is not a happy ending. I want to be honest with you about that, because I have read enough of these stories to know that we like our endings tied up in a bow, and life is not built that way. My son is still married to a woman who put her hand on my face. My granddaughter is being raised by that woman. I will not see Hattie at her high school graduation if Bryn is in the audience, and that hurts me every day I think about it. But the lake house is mine. The accounts are mine. The accounts are mine. The trust is locked, and Hattie is safe inside it. My boy knows for the first time in his adult life what it costs to be a man who does not stand up. And on the Sunday mornings when Hattie is here, when she comes padding down the hall in her pajamas asking for blueberry pancakes, when she sits at the table where her grandmother once sat, when she tells me about Mr. Dew, Thanik the Heron and her social studies project, and what she wants to be when she grows up. On those mornings, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. In the house I built with my own hands. In the chair Helen used to sit in, with the only person in the world who has the right to ask me for the keys to anything. Helen, if you are listening, and I think you might be, I should have spoken sooner. I should have spoken at the Deviled Eggs 4 years ago when your sister was still putting plates out and our boy was still ours. I am sorry I did not. I am not sorry now, and to anyone hearing this who recognizes themselves in it, the parent who has been quietly subsidizing, the grandparent who has been quietly enduring, the widower or widow whose grown child has begun to look at you the way Bryn looked at me across that breakfast table. I will tell you what Margaret told me on the porch that Sunday night, after the deed was in the wood stove and the letters were in the box and the loons had started up again on the dark water. She said, "Theo, love is not a checkbook, and family is not whoever happens to have your last name." I have thought about that sentence every day since. I have come to believe it is the most important thing anyone ever said to me, after the things Helen said. The keys to my house stay with me. They will go to Hattie. They will never, in any version of any future I can imagine, go to the woman who slapped me on my own porch. And if my son ever, on any morning of any year, decides he wants to be the kind of man who could have stood up that day, he knows where to find me. The coffee is on. The porch is open. The door has been changed. But the welcome has not. Tell me in the comments. What would you have done? And more importantly, what did you do when it was your turn and the person across the table reached for something that was not theirs? I want to hear from you. All of you. The ones who signed. The ones who didn't. The ones who are sitting at a breakfast table this Sunday, watching it begin. You are not alone, and the keys are still yours. I've turned this Sunday over in my mind more times than I can count, and the thing that keeps coming back to me is not the slap. It is the quiet hour before the slap. The pancakes. The orange juice with the pulp. Hattie's powdered sugar chin. The manila folder Bryn had taken the trouble to tab. Every single thing that happened on my porch that morning had been built, slowly and patiently, by choices I myself had made over 34 years. I built it when I wired $68,000 to a closing in Falmouth without asking my son to put a single dollar of his own beside it. I built it when I let Bryn ask about estate planning over Helen's casket spray, and I said, "Not today," instead of "not ever." I built it every time I told myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as being a good father, when really it was the easier thing, and the easier thing is almost never the right one. A man does not get slapped on his own porch by accident. He gets slapped because somewhere along the line he taught the person across the table that there would be no cost to it. That is the hardest thing I've had to admit at 68 years old, and I will not pretend it did not hurt to admit it. But cause and effect runs the other direction too. And that is the part I want you to hold on to if you are listening to this and you recognize yourself in it. The day I picked up the phone and called Margaret, I started building something different. The day I sat on a diner booth across from my son and told him I would not do the work of being his conscience for him, I started building something different. Every locked door, every amended trust, every Sunday morning, Hattie comes padding down my hall in her pajamas. Those are the new house I am building, board by board, the way Helen and I built the first one in 1987. What I want to leave you with is 3 things, because I have lived long enough to know that life mostly comes down to 3 things. Be honest, even when it costs you the dinner. A man who cannot say no at his own breakfast table will end up signing his name to documents he never agreed to. Use your head before you use your checkbook. Love that pays for itself is not love. It is leasing, and the lease always comes due. And when the slap finally comes, and for some of you it will, do not waste it. Do not waste the clarity. Stand up the next morning and start over. 68 is not too late. 78 is not too late. The keys are still yours, every single one of them, until the day you decide to hand them over. And on that day, hand them to someone who has earned them. Hattie has earned them. Nobody else in the story has, and I am at peace with that.